I was never the kind of person to be afraid of the woods. I grew up in rural Oregon, spending most of my childhood exploring the forests near my grandfather's cabin. The outdoors had always been my escape, a place where the noise of life faded into the sound of wind moving through the trees. That's why, after a long stretch of working in the city, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Cascade Mountains. I wanted peace. I wanted silence. I wanted to be alone. I packed light, just the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a small cooking kit, a knife, and enough food and water to last me 5 days. I also brought my rifle, not because I was planning to hunt, but because I knew the area had its share of black bears and cougars. I wasn't worried about them, though. I had spent years camping alone, and I knew how to handle myself in the wild. The drive to the trailhead was long, nearly 4 hours of winding roads that turned from pavement to gravel, then finally to dirt. I had chosen a spot far from any designated campsites, a place that required a good day's hike to reach. It was isolated, surrounded by thick pine forest with a river running through a deep ravine. I had been there once before, years ago, and I remembered it being perfect. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. I should have arrived earlier, but traffic out of the city had slowed me down. I debated whether I should set up camp closer to the car and hike in the morning, but I didn't like that idea. I wanted to wake up deep in the woods, far from anything or anyone. So I strapped on my pack, checked my gear, and started walking. The hike was harder than I remembered. The trail was steep in some places, overgrown in others. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. After about 3 hours, I reached my spot. The clearing was just as I remembered it: flat, sheltered by tall trees with the river about 50 yards away. The sound of rushing water echoed through the trees, blending with the wind in a way that felt almost hypnotic. I wasted no time setting up camp. The sun had already set, and darkness was creeping in fast. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and ate a quick meal of canned chili and bread. The night was cold, but the fire kept me warm. I sat for a while, staring into the flames, letting my mind drift. That's when I noticed something, a sound. At first, I thought it was the river. The rushing water could be deceptive, sometimes making it seem like something was moving in the trees. But as I sat there, I realized it was something else. A rhythmic crunching, slow and deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I scanned the darkness, seeing nothing but the vague outlines of trees beyond the firelight. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I shook it off and went to bed. I woke up early, feeling well-rested. The night had been uneventful after that first strange noise, and I convinced myself that it had been nothing. I spent the day exploring, hiking up the ridge to get a better view of the valley below. It was beautiful, untouched wilderness stretching as far as I could see. I found an old animal trail and followed it for a while, spotting tracks in the soft dirt. Deer mostly, but also something larger. A bear, judging by the size of the prints. I made a mental note to be cautious and headed back to camp. The rest of the day was peaceful. I fished in the river, cooked a proper meal over the fire, and sat watching the sky turn from blue to orange to black. And then, just like the night before, I heard it. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, my heart pounding. The fire cast long shadows through the trees, but I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was the river, the wind, and my own breathing. I waited, muscles tense. Nothing. After a while, I sat back down, keeping the rifle close. I didn't sleep as easily that night. By the third day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the tree line, listening for sounds that didn't belong. That night, I built the fire bigger than before. I wanted more light, more warmth, something to push back against the growing unease. The footsteps came again, closer. I didn't move this time. I sat still, staring into the trees, waiting. Then something moved. A shadow shifted, just beyond the firelight. Too big to be a deer, too quiet to be a bear. My grip tightened on the rifle, and then, just like before, the sound stopped. I stayed up for hours watching, listening, but nothing else happened. By the fourth day, I was done. The unease had settled deep in my gut, and I no longer felt safe. I packed my gear early, planning to hike out at first light. That night, I barely ate. I didn't want to stay up by the fire. I just wanted morning to come. But the footsteps came earlier this time, and they didn't stop. They circled the campsite, slow, steady, closer than before. I gripped the rifle so tight my knuckles ached. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. Then the sound stopped again. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. An hour. Then something changed. A sound I hadn't heard before. Breathing. Not mine. Slow. Ragged. Just beyond the tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then the tent moved. Just a slight press, like a hand running along the fabric. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the trees, and whatever was outside the tent bolted. I heard it crashing through the brush, fast, running on two legs. I didn't sleep after that. I sat with my rifle, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I broke camp in minutes. I hiked faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping until I reached my truck. I never looked back. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I didn't think much of it when I planned the trip. A weekend alone, deep in the woods, far from work, from the city, from everything. Just me, my gear, and the quiet. It was exactly what I needed. I drove for hours, taking smaller and smaller roads until pavement turned to dirt, then dirt to a pair of tire tracks barely visible in the overgrowth. The map on my phone had stopped updating miles ago. I wasn't worried. I had studied the area before coming out here. A vast stretch of wilderness, no towns for at least 50 miles in any direction. That's exactly what I wanted. I found a clearing beside a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of wood for a fire, and most importantly, no sign of people. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, clean. The kind of air you only get when you're far from everything. I set up my tent, got my firewood stacked, and by sundown, I was sitting by the flames, eating a simple meal and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, but peace is fragile. I woke up in the middle of the night. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned low, just embers now, barely giving off any light. The air was still, too still. I listened, trying to pick up on what had changed. Then I heard it, a rustling, slow and deliberate, somewhere beyond the tree line. It wasn't the wind. There was no wind. I stayed still, straining my ears. The sound came again, something moving through the brush. Not an animal, not the small, scurrying kind at least. This was bigger, heavier, something stepping carefully, like it didn't want to be heard. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. I sat there, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd woken up because the fire had gotten low, and my mind had filled the silence with noise that wasn't really there. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, leaving the flashlight within reach. Eventually, I drifted off again. Morning came slow and gray. I crawled out of my tent, stretching, shaking off the uneasy feeling from the night before. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I felt a cold wave roll through me. Someone had been here, watching. I bent down, studying them. They were deep, heavy, someone bigger than me. The prints came from the woods, circled the fire, stopped by my tent, then returned the way they came. No sign of panic, no hurried steps. Whoever it was, they took their time. I scanned the tree-line, heart pounding. Nothing. No broken branches. No sign of movement. I told myself it was just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw my fire, got curious. But I didn't believe it. A hunter would have announced themselves. A lost hiker would have called out. This person had done neither. I forced myself to go through the motions, made breakfast, packed up my gear for a day of hiking. I wasn't going to sit around and let my imagination make things worse. The woods were thick, but beautiful. Miles of untouched wilderness. No trails, no signs of people. I lost myself in it, letting the quiet settle my nerves. It worked for a while, until I found the tree. It was just off the path I'd been following, an old pine with something carved into the bark. I stepped closer, brushing dirt off the rough surface. The marks were deep, deliberate. Words. Leave now. The letters were jagged, uneven, like they'd been hacked into the wood with a knife. They weren't fresh. The edges had started to darken, weathering into the bark. I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But that didn't mean I was alone. I headed back to camp, faster than before. By the time I returned, the sky was dimming. I tossed more wood on the fire, trying to shake the unease. The footprints, the warning, it was all in my head. Just some old carving left behind by another camper. Nothing to do with me. That's what I told myself. Night came fast. The fire crackled, casting long shadows. I sat with my back to my truck, facing the woods. I wasn't going to sleep tonight. The silence stretched. The fire popped. I stared into the darkness, waiting for something to move. Then I heard it. The same sound as the night before. Slow, careful steps. Coming closer. I gripped my flashlight, heart hammering. I waited. The sound stopped. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. Just standing there, watching. I clicked on my flashlight, aiming it straight at them. The beam cut through the dark, empty space. They were gone. I scanned the trees, my pulse slamming in my ears. Nothing. But I knew what I saw. I grabbed my knife, my axe. If they wanted to test me, they'd get a fight. Minutes crawled by, then an hour. Nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe my brain was twisting shadows into shapes. Then I smelled it. A foul, rotting stench carried on the breeze, like something dead. I wasn't staying to find out what it was. I packed fast, throwing gear into my truck. The fire was still burning as I climbed in, turned the key. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas. The road back was rough, the truck bouncing over roots and rocks. My headlights cut through the dark, showing nothing but endless trees. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. Not until I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Tall. Still. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, tires kicking up dirt. My headlights caught their face. A mask. Not a ski mask, not a balaclava, something older. Handmade. Leather. Stretched tight. Stitched with crude thread. I didn't wait. I hit the gas. The figure didn't move. Not until the last second, stepping aside as I tore past. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement, until the trees thinned and the sky turned gray with the first light of morning. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, breath ragged. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed. I don't want to know. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone watched my camp? That they left footprints and stood in the road? The woods are big. Too big. People go missing all the time. I wasn't going to be one of them, and I'll never go back. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd been feeling drained, burned out from work, and overwhelmed by the city's noise. I needed a break, some real quiet, the kind you can only find deep in the woods, far from highways, stores, and people. I picked a remote spot in Washington, somewhere way off the beaten path. I wasn't going to a regular campsite with marked trails and bathrooms. I wanted real wilderness. I found a place near a small, unnamed lake on a topographic map, miles from any town or road. It was the perfect spot. The drive out took half the day. I followed back roads that turned into dirt tracks, then into something barely passable for a vehicle. I parked my truck at the base of a hill, shouldered my pack, and hiked in. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the occasional bird, the crunch of my boots, and the rustling of branches in the wind. This was exactly what I wanted. I set up camp near the lake, clearing a small area for my tent. The water was calm, reflecting the graying sky. I built a fire, ate a quick meal, and sat there as darkness settled in. It was peaceful, but there was something else. A feeling I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just being alone, so far from everything. I pushed the thought away, put out the fire, and climbed into my tent. I lay there, listening to the forest sounds. A distant owl, leaves shifting in the breeze, a few twigs cracking somewhere far off. I wasn't worried. Animals moved at night, and I'd taken enough trips to know the usual sounds. Then I heard something different. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. Not an animal. Too heavy. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then, nothing. Just the wind. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch falling, a deer passing by. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I went down to the lake, washed my face, and drank some water. The sun was out, and I felt foolish for getting spooked the night before. I spent the day hiking, exploring the area. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, feeling good. The woods were quiet, peaceful. I built another fire, ate, and sat by the flames as the sun dipped. That's when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. Near the edge of my camp, something was off. A small pile of rocks that hadn't been there before, stacked deliberately. I stared at it, stomach tightening. I hadn't done that. No wind or animal could have arranged them like that. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, kicked over the pile and tried to move on. Night fell. I climbed into my tent, but I couldn't relax. That uneasy feeling from the night before was back, stronger this time. Then, footsteps, closer than before. Slow, careful. I stayed completely still, heart hammering. The sound circled my tent. Deliberate, calculated. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to scare me off. They were testing me, seeing if I'd react. I gripped the knife I kept in my pack and listened. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard something worse. Breathing, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound moved away. I heard the steps fade into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, gripping my knife, waiting for morning. As soon as the sky started turning gray, I packed up. I wasn't staying another night. I moved quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack, ready to get out of there. But then I saw it. A single boot print. Not mine. Someone had been standing outside my tent, watching me. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could, heart pounding the whole way. The forest, once peaceful, now felt wrong. Every sound made me jump. When I reached my truck, relief flooded me. I threw my gear in the back and climbed in. But as I started the engine, something caught my eye. A man standing just at the tree line, dressed in dark clothes, face half hidden by shadows. Watching, I didn't wait. I hit the gas, tearing down the dirt road. I didn't stop, didn't look back until I was miles away. When I finally reached cell service, I called the local sheriff. They sent someone out to check the area, but they found nothing. No sign of the man, no tracks, no stacked rocks. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night, and I don't want to find out. I had been camping in different places across France for years, always alone, always in remote areas. It was something I had started in my early 20s, and by now, well into my 30s, I had it down to a routine. I chose places far from crowded campsites, away from tourist spots, where I could be surrounded by nothing but forest, rivers, and open land. This trip was supposed to be like all the others, just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I had picked a location in central France, a stretch of wilderness near the Loire Valley, but far from any villages or hiking trails. The land was thick with trees, mostly oak and pine, with patches of open fields scattered throughout. A small river cut through the area, and the land sloped gently in places, creating natural clearings perfect for setting up camp. I had studied maps before leaving, making sure I wasn't near private property or too close to roads. The plan was to spend a few nights there, hike around during the day, and enjoy the solitude. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car off a dirt path about a kilometer from where I planned to camp, and hiked the rest of the way with my backpack. The sun was still up, but the trees cast long shadows, and the air was starting to cool. I had chosen a clearing near the river, a spot that looked untouched. The ground was dry, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, and there was plenty of space to pitch my tent. I set up quickly, unpacking my gear, making sure everything was in place. I had a small fire going as the sun dipped lower, cooking a simple meal and enjoying the stillness. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times to the sounds of the forest, branches shifting in the wind, the distant call of an owl, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, but nothing unusual. By morning, the sky was overcast, a thick layer of gray clouds stretching across the horizon. It had rained recently before my trip, and the air smelled damp, the ground still soft in some places. I spent most of the day hiking, covering a few kilometers in different directions, making sure to keep track of my location. There was no sign of other people, no footprints, no trash, nothing that suggested anyone had been through the area in a long time. By the second night, I had settled into the routine. The fire crackled as I ate, the river nearby providing a soft, constant sound. The clouds remained thick, and the forest felt darker than usual. As I sat by the fire, I had this brief feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. It was the kind of feeling that sneaks up on you in the wild, where your brain plays tricks on you, making you hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. I told myself it was just the isolation, the deep woods pressing in, and brushed it off. I climbed into my tent, zipping the entrance shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. I always kept my flashlight within reach, along with a knife, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked being prepared. The night stretched on, and I drifted in and out of sleep, waking occasionally to the sounds outside. But something felt different this time. It wasn't just the usual forest noises. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate steps crunching on the ground. Not an animal. Too heavy, too careful. I lay completely still, listening. The steps continued, circling the area, moving between the trees near my tent. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to make any noise, didn't want to let whoever or whatever. It was know that I was awake. The steps stopped, then started again, this time moving closer. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, my body tense, every muscle on edge. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance. I waited a long time before moving, before finally allowing myself to breathe normally. I didn't sleep much after that. When the first hint of morning light filtered through the tent, I got up immediately. I stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed, but I knew what I had heard. I debated packing up and leaving, but I had come all this way, and part of me didn't want to be scared off by something that could have just been a lone hiker passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day exploring again, going further this time, looking for any sign of someone else camping in the area. There was nothing, no tents, no campfire remains, no footprints. If someone had been out there the night before, they had left no trace. That night, I made sure my fire was bigger, the light reaching further into the trees. I kept my flashlight on my lap as I sat by the fire, scanning the tree line. I told myself that if I heard the footsteps again, I would confront whatever it was. Let them know I was aware. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Then I heard it. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. I tensed, my heart pounding, my grip tightening around the flashlight. The steps were closer this time, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The presence, the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Then the sound changed. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was breathing. Deep, measured breathing just beyond the trees. I grabbed my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stood up slowly, shining the flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on empty space. The breathing stopped. The forest fell silent. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, scanning the trees, waiting for something, anything, to move, but nothing did. Eventually, I backed toward my tent, my flashlight sweeping the area in front of me. I didn't turn my back to the trees. I didn't let myself look away. When I reached my tent, I slipped inside, zipping it up tight, my knife still in hand. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, the forest looked normal again, but I knew better. I packed up my gear in record time, barely stopping to eat. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the trees. The feeling never left, not even when I reached the dirt path and spotted my car in the distance. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, my mind racing. I didn't know what had been out there. Maybe it was just a hunter, maybe a drifter passing through, maybe something else. But I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be coming back. I started the car, turned onto the road, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the woods. I had been feeling off lately, stressed from work, restless at home, stuck in a loop of routine. I needed to clear my mind, and nothing did that better than being out in the wild. I had done this kind of thing before, and I knew what I was doing. I picked a remote area deep in the forests of Montana, far from any designated campsites or crowded hiking trails. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect from everything and everyone. The plan was simple. 3 days, just me, my tent, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I had packed carefully, enough food, water, and supplies to last, along with my hunting rifle just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but it was always smart to be prepared. The drive out took hours. The farther I went, the more the roads turned from pavement to dirt, winding through the thickening trees. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, the sun was beginning to set. I parked my truck on a barely visible path, took my gear, and hiked another mile into the trees before setting up camp. It was perfect. The woods were dense and quiet, apart from the distant sounds of birds and rustling leaves. No signs of other people, just how I wanted it. I set up my tent near a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The ground was solid, the air crisp, the scent of damp earth filling my lungs. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of the wild. The night was peaceful, but then, sometime past midnight, I heard something, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was an animal, a rustling in the distance, twigs snapping underfoot. It wasn't unusual to hear movement in the woods at night, but then it stopped, too suddenly, like something or someone had frozen in place. I sat up, my senses sharp. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak shadows against the trees. I reached for my rifle and listened. Silence. Then, another crunch. Closer this time. I turned toward the sound, scanning the darkness. My flashlight was in the tent, out of reach. The rifle felt solid in my hands, but I didn't want to fire blindly into the night. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound disappeared. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just the wind shifting through the trees. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Nothing. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and forced myself to lie back down. Maybe it was an animal after all. A deer, a raccoon. Something harmless. I told myself that over and over until I finally drifted off. The next morning, I woke to a strange feeling. A sense that something was off. I climbed out of my tent, stretched, and looked around. The forest was still, the sky a dull gray. Then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They were in the dirt near the edge of my camp, leading from the trees, circling near my tent, then vanishing back into the woods. I crouched down, studying them. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp. Someone had been here, watching. I stood up, scanning the trees. The forest looked the same, but now it felt different, unsettling. I wasn't alone out here. I checked my supplies. Everything was still there. Nothing had been taken or disturbed. Whoever it was, they hadn't come for my gear. They had just watched. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to. I had come out here to clear my mind, to escape. I wasn't about to let some stranger ruin that. Still, I kept my rifle closer that day. The hours passed in uneasy silence. I hiked a little, staying close to camp, always keeping an eye on my surroundings. By evening, I forced myself to relax. Maybe it had just been a lost hiker passing through. Maybe I was overreacting. As night fell, I built up the fire, making sure it burned bright. The light made me feel safer, even if it wouldn't do much against an actual threat. I sat by the flames, eating, listening, waiting, and then, just as before, the sounds started. This time, they were louder, closer, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. I gripped my rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. My breath felt too loud, too obvious. Then, for the first time, I saw him. A figure, tall, unmoving, standing just beyond the firelight. He wasn't an animal. He wasn't a lost hiker. He was something else. I couldn't see his face, only his shape, dark, featureless, watching. I raised my rifle. "Who's there?" Silence. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. I kept my aim steady, finger on the trigger, ready. Then, slowly, he took a step back, another, and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, every nerve in my body wired. I wanted to leave, but I wasn't going to hike through the woods in the dark. Not when I knew he was out there. The first light, I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I broke down the tent, stuffed everything into my bag. I moved quickly, retracing my path back to the truck. The woods felt suffocating, the silence too heavy. And then I saw them. More footprints, fresh ones, leading to my truck. The doors were closed. Nothing seemed out of place, but I checked anyway. Under the truck, in the bed, inside, nothing. I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and peeled out of there so fast the tires spit dirt and rocks. I didn't stop driving for hours, didn't look in the rearview mirror. When I finally made it back to town, I parked outside a diner, hands still shaking. I never went back to that forest, never camped alone again, because somewhere out there, in the silence of those trees, someone was watching, waiting, and I wasn't going to give them a second chance. I had been planning the trip for months. It was meant to be a break from everything: work, the constant buzz of city life, and the feeling of being trapped in routine. I wanted quiet, solitude, and time to think. Camping alone had never been something I was afraid of. I had done it plenty of times before, ever since I was a teenager. I knew the basics. I respected nature. I wasn't the type to take risks or do anything stupid. The spot I had chosen was deep in the woods of northern Idaho. A friend had told me about it years ago, an isolated stretch of forest not too far from the Montana border. It was far enough from town that I wouldn't see another soul, but not so remote that I couldn't hike out if something went wrong. There was a river nearby, plenty of game, and dense woods that would keep me hidden from any wandering hikers. Not that I expected many. This place wasn't on any map, not really. It was just a spot I had marked in an old notebook, a place I had always wanted to visit but never got around to. The drive up was uneventful. I had packed enough supplies for a week: food, water, extra fuel, and all the camping gear I needed. I left my truck parked near an old logging road and hiked in about 5 miles to where I planned to set up camp. The first day was peaceful. I pitched my tent in a small clearing, gathered some wood, and started a fire as the sun dipped below the trees. The air was cool, the scent of pine and damp earth thick around me. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. I slept fine that night. The sounds of the forest were familiar. Branches creaking, distant owls, the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I had a rifle with me just in case, but I wasn't worried. I had been in the woods enough to know the difference between normal sounds and something worth panicking over. The second day was when things started feeling off. I spent the morning hiking along the river, fishing a little, just enjoying the quiet. I didn't see any sign of people. No footprints, no trash, nothing to suggest anyone had been through here in a long time. That was what I wanted. But by the time I got back to camp that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing had been moved. There were no tracks around my tent or fire pit. But the woods felt different. Quieter, maybe, like the usual background noise of the forest had dulled just a little. I told myself I was imagining it. That night, I barely slept. Every few hours, I'd wake up, feeling like something had pulled me out of sleep. Not a sound exactly, just an awareness. I'd lie there, staring at the roof of my tent, listening. The fire outside had burned low, casting weak, flickering shadows against the fabric. The woods seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. At one point, maybe around 3 in the morning, I heard movement. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the forest floor. I stayed still, gripping my rifle, heart pounding. The steps stopped after a few seconds, and then nothing. I listened for another hour before I finally let myself relax, but I never went fully back to sleep. By the next morning, I was debating whether to cut the trip short. But leaving meant hiking 5 miles back to the truck, and I didn't like the idea of making that walk while feeling watched. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe an animal had wandered close. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided to stay at least one more night. That was a mistake. I spent the day on edge, checking the area around my camp more carefully than before. I still didn't find anything. No prints, no signs of anything unusual. But the feeling never left me. That sense of being watched, of something just beyond my vision. That night, I kept my fire going longer than usual. I sat up, my rifle across my lap, staring into the trees. The wind had picked up, making the branches sway, casting shifting shadows in the firelight. I forced myself to stay awake as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I climbed into my tent and shut my eyes, rifle still in my hands. At some point, I woke up again. It was dead silent. The fire had burned down to nothing but glowing embers. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, couldn't hear the usual sounds of insects or distant animals, just silence. And then a sound, a slow, careful footstep, maybe 20 feet from my tent. Then another, and another. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My fingers tightened around my rifle. The steps were closer now, just outside the faint glow of the dying embers. I could just barely make out a shape through the thin fabric of the tent. A shadow standing completely still. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I knew. It was human. It stood there for what felt like hours. Then slowly it moved. The shadow shifted, stepping away from my tent, disappearing into the trees. I didn't dare move. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn began creeping through the trees. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't even eat. I just grabbed everything I could, threw dirt over the fire pit, and started hiking back toward the truck. My hands were shaking. My ears were straining for any sound behind me. The whole way back, I felt it. That same feeling. The weight of unseen eyes. The knowledge that I wasn't alone. That whoever or whatever had been watching me all night was still there, just out of sight, following. I made it to the truck, tossed my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine so fast my hands barely functioned. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by the safety of civilization. I never went back to that spot. I never even told anyone about it. because there was nothing to tell, not really. No proof, no evidence, nothing that made sense. Just a feeling, presence, a shadow in the night, and the certainty that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it out at all. It was the last night of my training. We had been out in the woods for a little over a week, testing our endurance, survival skills, and ability to navigate under pressure. I was exhausted, my body sore from endless hikes, drills, and setting up camp every night only to tear it down again at dawn. The group had been shrinking as the days went by. Some tapped out, others got injured, and a few were sent back for failing key tasks. I had made it this far, and I wasn't about to fail now. The final night was supposed to be straightforward. A solo night in the woods. No partners, no backup, no lights. We were each assigned a separate section of the forest and given only a basic survival kit, knife, canteen, emergency whistle, and a few protein bars. No tents, just a sleeping bag and whatever cover nature provided. The instructors wanted to see how well we could handle being alone. The area I was assigned was deep in the forest, far from the main camp. I had hiked a good hour to get there, the sun already low in the sky. The trees were thick, towering, and cast long shadows across the uneven ground. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and aside from the distant sounds of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl, it was quiet. Too quiet. I found a spot against a fallen tree, its massive trunk providing decent cover from the wind. The ground was hard, packed with dead leaves and roots, but I had slept in worse conditions. I cleared a small area, spread out my sleeping bag, and sat down with my back to the log. The air was cool, and as the last bit of light faded, I took a sip from my canteen, listening to the sounds of the forest. I wasn't scared of the dark, and I had spent enough time out here to know that most of the noises people found unsettling. Rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant movement were just the normal sounds of the wilderness. I had been trained to recognize them. I knew what was natural and what wasn't. It was around midnight when I first noticed it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, not crunching through leaves but careful, precise. Someone, something, was moving through the forest, and they weren't just passing by. They were circling me. I stayed still, gripping my knife tightly. My breathing slowed as I listened, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps would move a little, then stop. Move a little more, then stop. They weren't rushing, weren't wandering. They were observing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, exhaustion warping normal sounds into something sinister. But deep down, I knew better. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. The footsteps faded at some point, lost in the natural sounds of the night, but I didn't relax. I kept my knife in my hand, my back pressed against the log. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, my eyes snapped open, and it was still dark. But something was wrong. The air was different. The forest had gone silent. No insects, no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time, footsteps, and breathing. It wasn't heavy, but it was there, slow, controlled. Someone was near me, watching, waiting. I didn't move. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife, my pulse thudding in my ears. I kept my breathing steady, pretending to still be asleep. Then the sound changed. Not footsteps anymore. Something dragging across the ground. Something heavy. I forced myself to stay still, eyes half-lidded in the dark. I didn't want to alert whoever or whatever. It was that I was awake. The sound moved around me, slow and deliberate. I caught glimpses of a shape moving just outside the faint glow of the moonlight. It was low to the ground, shifting in an unnatural way. Then it stopped. For several long, suffocating minutes, there was nothing. And then, a whisper of breath right next to my face. I snapped up, knife in hand, heart slamming against my ribs. But there was nothing there. The dragging sound was gone. The breathing was gone. But something had been there. The silence in the forest stretched out, suffocating. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the normal sounds of the night returned. The distant chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I gathered my things and moved fast, making my way back to the main camp without stopping. The instructors were waiting for us, taking roll as we returned. I kept my face neutral, but I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. As I looked around, I noticed something. Some of the others looked as shaken as I felt. One of the guys had a deep scratch on his arm, though he wouldn't talk about it. Another had left his sleeping bag behind entirely, refusing to go back for it. And then I saw one of the instructors watching us carefully, like he already knew, like he had expected this. No one said anything. No one acknowledged it. We finished the training, got our gear, and headed back to base. I never spoke about that night, never told anyone what I had heard, what I had felt. But I knew I wasn't alone out there. And whatever was out there, whoever was watching, *** knew I knew, ***, and that was enough to make sure I never, ever went back. It started as a simple weekend camping trip, something I had done plenty of times before. I wasn't new to the outdoors, and I had no reason to think this trip would be any different. The plan was to drive out to a remote section of national forest land, park at a small pull-off I had found on a map, and hike a few miles in to set up camp for the night. No official trails, no campgrounds, just raw, untouched wilderness. It was late October, and the air had that crisp bite that signaled winter was creeping in. The trees were mostly bare, with only a few stubborn leaves clinging to the branches. The sky was dull gray, and the forecast had mentioned a chance of rain overnight, but nothing too serious. I arrived at the pull-off in the early afternoon, parked my truck, and shouldered my pack. I had everything I needed, plenty of food, water, extra layers, a GPS, and a reliable old compass just in case. I had even printed out a topographic map of the area, though I figured I wouldn't need it much. The hike in was peaceful. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy. Just the occasional rustling of dry leaves or the distant call of a bird. I moved at a steady pace, following an old game trail that I had spotted on satellite images. It was overgrown, but still visible enough to follow. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was flat, surrounded by thick trees, and had a small stream running nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked myself a simple meal as the sun dipped lower in the sky. As night fell, the woods took on a different feeling. The temperature dropped quickly, and the silence became even more noticeable. There was no wind, no distant traffic noise, just the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of unseen creatures moving through the brush. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the warmth, before finally crawling into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow outside my tent. Everything was still, too still. I listened, holding my breath, but I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary. No footsteps, no animals, no wind, just silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just woken up from a dream. I rolled over and forced myself to go back to sleep. Morning came with a thick layer of fog hanging in the trees. Everything felt damp, and the air was even colder than the night before. I made some coffee, packed up my gear, and got ready to hike back. That's when I realized something was off. I should have been able to see the game trail I had followed in, but it wasn't there. The fog made it difficult to see too far, but even walking a short distance in the direction I thought I had come from, I found nothing. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen was blank. Dead battery. That didn't make sense. I had charged it before leaving. Frustrated, I took out my compass. At least that still worked. I knew I had come from the west, so I started walking in that direction, keeping an eye on my compass to make sure I wasn't veering off course. The fog made it hard to tell if I was covering new ground or backtracking. but I figured as long as I kept heading west, I would eventually find the road. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. I wasn't making progress. I should have reached my truck by now. Even if I had gotten turned around a little, the area wasn't that big. I should have at least seen some kind of landmark I recognized. Panic started creeping in. I forced myself to stop and take stock of my situation. My water was still mostly full, I had some food left, and I could make a fire if I needed to. I wasn't in immediate danger, but I needed to figure out where I was before the sun went down. I decided to climb a tree to get above the fog and look for the road. Took some effort, but I managed to get high enough to see. Nothing, just endless trees fading into the mist. No road, no sign of human presence. I climbed down, heart pounding. Something was wrong. I walked for hours. The fog lifted, but I still couldn't find my way out. The forest felt different, wrong somehow. The terrain wasn't what I remembered. The trees seemed thicker, the ground rockier. It was like I had wandered into a completely different part of the forest. As night approached, I knew I had to stop and set up camp again. I found another small clearing, built a fire, and tried to stay calm. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. Not an animal, not the wind, something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It stopped. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows through the woods. I strained my eyes, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound was gone. I barely slept that night. Every small noise set my nerves on edge. I kept my knife close, even though I had no idea what I was afraid of. Morning came and I packed up quickly. I needed to get out. I hiked all day, trying different directions, but it didn't matter. Every time I thought I was making progress, I would end up somewhere I had already been. It was impossible. By the third night, I had stopped feeling hungry. I was exhausted, but too afraid to sleep. The forest was playing tricks on me. I would see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting, movement just beyond my vision. The sound came back, closer this time. Not footsteps, not breathing, just movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I didn't care which direction, I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. I stumbled into a clearing and saw something that nearly made me collapse with relief. A road, a paved, 2-lane road cutting through the trees. I don't even remember running to it. One moment I was in the forest, the next I was standing in the middle of the empty road, gasping for breath. I followed the road for miles before finally finding a small service station. I must have looked like hell, dirty, scratched up, eyes wild, because the guy working there barely asked any questions before offering me water and letting me use his phone. I never found out what happened. My GPS was fried. My compass? The needle was spinning in slow circles when I checked it. I went back once, weeks later, with some friends. I wanted to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. We never found the place where I camped. The pull-off where I had parked my truck was still there, but the game trail? Gone. Like it had never existed. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I never will again. I've never been the kind of person who liked crowded places. Cities made me anxious. The noise, the traffic, the constant movement, it was too much. That's why I started camping. Being alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of nature, was the only thing that ever made me feel truly at peace. I had been camping for years, always going on solo trips deep into the wilderness. It wasn't just a hobby. It was something I needed. Every few months, I'd pack up my gear, drive out to a remote location, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No phone, no people, just me and the forest. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. I had chosen a new spot, a dense forest in a rural area, far from any hiking trails. It was a place where I could be truly alone. The drive out there took most of the day. The farther I got from the city, the quieter it became. The roads turned to gravel, and soon after that, They became nothing more than dirt paths cutting through the trees. I followed the directions I had written down, taking turn after turn, until I reached a clearing deep in the woods. It was perfect. I parked my truck near the tree line, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. The sun was starting to go down by the time I finished. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of insects and distant birds. I built a small fire, made some food, and sat in my camping chair, staring into the flames as the night settled around me. Everything felt normal, but looking back, I realize now that I had made my first mistake before I even arrived. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. The first night passed without anything unusual happening. I slept well, wrapped in my sleeping bag, with the sounds of the forest lulling me into a deep sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. I took my time making breakfast, enjoying the silence. After eating, I decided to go on a short hike. There were no marked trails, so I just picked a direction and started walking, making sure to leave small markers along the way so I could find my way back. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. I walked for about an hour, stopping occasionally to listen to the sounds around me. That's when I noticed it. The silence. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to have died down. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood still, listening, trying to understand what had changed. And then I heard it, a sound in the distance. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. A rustling noise, like something moving through the underbrush. I wasn't scared. Not yet. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. I had seen plenty of wildlife on my camping trips before, but something about the way the sound moved put me on edge. It wasn't the random, clumsy movement of an animal foraging. It was slow, deliberate. I decided to head back to my camp. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen. The forest was still silent, and every now and then, I would hear that same rustling sound behind me, always at a distance. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was starting to set. I felt relieved to be back. I told myself I had just imagined things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I built a fire again, but this time, I wasn't as relaxed as before. I kept looking out into the darkness, scanning the trees. The fire's glow only reached so far, and beyond that, the forest was pitch black. I ate my dinner quickly, listening for any sounds beyond the crackling flames. The silence was unnatural. Even the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, owls, crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. The same rustling sound, but this time it was closer. I froze, my body tensing. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the noise. Nothing. The trees stood still, their dark shapes blending together. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I knew something was out there. I told myself it was just an animal. That was the logical explanation, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I decided to sleep in my truck that night. I locked the doors and reclined the seat, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening. And then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate movement, right outside my truck. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on the dirt. Not the quick, scattered steps of an animal, but slow, measured steps, like someone was circling my truck. I lay there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps would stop for long stretches of time, only to start again a few minutes later. Eventually, at some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from sleeping in the truck. I looked around, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place. My tent was still standing. My gear was untouched. but the dirt around my truck was disturbed. There were footprints, human footprints. I knew then that I needed to leave. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. As I loaded my last bag into the truck, I heard it one last time, the rustling, but this time it was closer than ever. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and tore out of there, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow forest road. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I saw it. There was something stuck under the windshield wiper. A small, folded piece of paper. I reached out with shaking hands and pulled it free. 3 words were written in smudged pencil. "You were lucky. I never went back, and I never camped alone again." I still think about that trip sometimes. Comes back in pieces. Small details that make my stomach tighten. The damp smell of pine needles, the flicker of a campfire burning low, the sound of something moving outside the tent. I remember the feeling of being watched, that deep, primal fear that tells you something isn't right. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 21. My stepbrother, Ryan, was a year older than me. We weren't particularly close growing up. Our parents got married when we were both in our teens, and by then we had our own lives. He was into sports, always hanging around with his team. I was quieter, more into hiking and being outdoors. We only really saw each other at family events, and even then, it was mostly polite small talk. That summer, though, we ended up planning a camping trip together. It wasn't really our idea. Our parents had been pushing us to spend more time together, and I guess we just went along with it. We picked a spot about 3 hours from home, a remote area in Washington state. It wasn't an official campground, just a place we found online that some hikers had talked about. It was deep in the woods, far from any towns or main roads. Exactly the kind of place I liked. We packed up the truck and left early in the morning, stopping once for supplies. The drive was long, winding through narrow forest roads that became rougher the deeper we went. By the time we reached the site, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place was beautiful. Tall evergreens, a small clearing for the tent, and a narrow river running nearby. No cell service, no noise except for the wind and the water. Perfect. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent and gathering firewood before it got too dark. Ryan wasn't as experienced with camping as I was, but he followed my lead without complaining. The fire crackled as we ate, the air cooling as night settled in. It wasn't until later, as I was sitting by the fire, that I started to feel off. At first, it was just a nagging sense of unease, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you know nothing's there. I told myself it was just the isolation. We were miles from anyone, cut off completely. It was natural to feel a little on edge. But then I heard it, a sound from the trees, a rustling, deliberate and slow. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying. It was heavier, measured. I looked at Ryan, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the fire, poking at it with a stick. I turned back to the trees, staring into the dark. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond that, everything was shadows. My skin prickled. Then it stopped. Silence. Nothing but the river and the crackling fire. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. Probably just an animal, a deer or something, but that feeling stayed with me. That night, we climbed into the tent, zipping it up tight. It was cold, but I didn't mind. I liked the weight of the sleeping bag around me. It made me feel protected. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up. I didn't know why at first. I just knew something was wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, heart pounding. It wasn't Ryan. He was still asleep beside me, breathing steady. The steps stopped, right outside. I could hear the faint sound of breathing. Not an animal. Human. My stomach clenched. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps started again, circling the tent. Slow, deliberate. Then something brushed against the fabric. I felt the pressure through the material, just inches from my face. I wanted to scream, to wake Ryan, to do something, but I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The footsteps faded. The breathing disappeared. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I didn't think I fell asleep, but the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the trees, the fire reduced to embers. Ryan stretched, yawning. "You sleep okay?" I hesitated. "Yeah, fine." I don't know why I didn't tell him. Maybe I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe I was trying to convince myself it had just been a dream. But then I saw them. Footprints. Deep impressions in the dirt, circling the tent. Too big for an animal. Too precise. Ryan saw them too. He frowned, stepping closer. Were those? Not ours. The words hung between us. We checked the area, but there was nothing else. No signs of anyone. No explanation. Ryan laughed it off, saying it was probably some hunter passing through. But I saw the way he kept glancing around, the tension in his shoulders. We should have packed up right then. Left while it was still light. But we didn't. The second night was worse. The fire didn't feel comforting anymore. The woods felt different, too quiet, too still. We went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening, waiting, and then it came back. The footsteps. This time it wasn't just walking. It was closer, more deliberate. Something pressed against the tent, harder than before. A long, slow drag of fingers, or something like fingers, against the fabric. I could hear the breathing again. Then, a zipper. Not ours. A different tent. I realized, with a sick jolt, that we weren't alone. Somewhere, in the dark, there was another tent. One we hadn't seen. Someone had been there the whole time, watching us. I shot up, shaking Ryan awake. "Get up." "What?" "We're leaving." I didn't care how late it was. I didn't care if we had to hike in the dark. I wasn't staying another second. We threw everything into the truck, not bothering to pack properly. As we drove away, I glanced back. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. We never talked about it after that. Never told anyone. But I know what I saw, and I know we were never supposed to leave that place alive. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the northern regions of Italy. I had been traveling through Europe for months, moving from one country to another, mostly staying in hostels, but every now and then, I preferred to get away from people, to be alone in nature. Camping was something I enjoyed, and Italy had some incredible places for it. I had mapped out a route through the Dolomites, known for their jagged peaks and deep valleys, but I didn't want to stay in the tourist-heavy areas. I had read about a lesser-known forested region just a few hours from the Austrian border, a place where you could hike for days without running into another soul. That sounded perfect. I had all the gear I needed: tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, enough food for a few days. The plan was simple. Hike deep into the woods, set up camp, and enjoy a few days of solitude before heading back to civilization. I arrived at the edge of the forest in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, casting long shadows over the thick, green canopy. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I could hear nothing but the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and untouched. By the time the sun started dipping below the peaks, I had found a perfect camping spot. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving stream with enough open space for a fire. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and soon had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and sat there for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. At some point, I must have dozed off by the fire because I woke up to the sensation of cold creeping in. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest was completely dark. I checked my watch just past midnight. That's when I heard it. A sound, a soft crunch, footsteps. I sat completely still, listening. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but these steps were slow, deliberate, too controlled for an animal. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction. To my right, beyond the trees, I reached for my flashlight, slowly, careful not to make noise, and clicked it on. I aimed it in the direction of the sound, but the beam only caught trees, nothing else. The steps had stopped the moment I turned on the light. For a long moment, I stayed frozen, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my own paranoia getting the best of me. I turned off the flashlight and sat there, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. The forest was silent again. I let out a slow breath and decided it was nothing. Probably an animal after all. I stood up, stretched, and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. Inside, I felt safer. The thin nylon fabric wouldn't stop anything from getting in, but it gave me a sense of separation from the vast darkness outside. I lay back, listening to the distant sounds of nature, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something had woken me. I listened. The fire outside was completely dead now. The night was silent, but I could feel something was different. Then I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Soft, steady breathing. Close. Right outside my tent. A chill ran down my spine. My heart started pounding. I was fully awake now, every sense alert. I stayed as still as I could, barely even breathing myself. The sound was coming from just a few feet away. Then, slowly, the breathing moved. It circled my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves under slow, deliberate steps, pacing around me. I had no weapons, nothing to defend myself with. My knife was in my backpack outside. The flashlight was next to me, but I hesitated to turn it on. If I did, would I want to see what was out there? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The pacing stopped. Silence again. Then, a soft tap. Fingertips against the nylon of my tent. I nearly stopped breathing. My mind raced. Who was out here? I was miles from the nearest town, deep in a forest where no one should be. The tapping moved. A slow, deliberate drag of fingers along the fabric. I gripped my flashlight, ready to shine it in their face, to at least see who was tormenting me. But just as I was about to move, the sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so tense. I listened for any sign of movement, any indication that whoever was out there was still nearby. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped a tiny part of my tent door and peered outside. The moon was high, casting enough light to see the clearing. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. My backpack, my cooking gear, the cold remains of my fire. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But I knew what I heard. For the rest of the night, I sat inside my tent, gripping my flashlight, waiting. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare make a sound. At first light, I packed up my gear in record time and started hiking back. I moved quickly, constantly checking over my shoulder, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on me. I never saw anyone, but as I neared the edge of the forest, something caught my eye. A tree, not far from where I had camped, scratched into the bark, deep and fresh. A single word, smile. I stared at it, my skin crawling. I never went camping alone again. I didn't want to go camping with my boss, but I didn't have much of a choice. It was his idea. He had been talking about it for weeks at work, saying he needed a break from everything, that a weekend in the woods would do him good. Somehow I got roped into it. Maybe because I was the only one who didn't flat out say no. Maybe because I was just too tired to argue when he insisted. We left on a Friday afternoon. It was early spring, and the air still had that lingering chill from winter, but the sun was out and the forecast didn't mention any storms. I packed my gear, filled up my truck, and met my boss at a gas station just outside of town. His name was Mark. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that made him look older than he was. He had been my boss for 2 years, and while he wasn't a bad guy, he had a way of talking that made it clear he expected things to go his way. We drove for a few hours, taking back roads that wound through empty farmland and patches of dense forest. The place he picked was remote, far enough from town that there wouldn't be any cell service, which was exactly what he wanted. Disconnect from everything, he had said at work. No distractions, just nature. I wasn't as excited about it as he was, but I figured a weekend off-grid wouldn't be the worst thing. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. We parked, unloaded our gear, and started the hike. It was about 4 miles to the campsite, deep in the woods, near a river. The trail wasn't well marked, but Mark had been there before, and he led the way. It felt colder as we walked. The trees blocked out most of the evening light, and the wind picked up, making the branches creak overhead. We didn't see another soul the entire hike, which wasn't surprising. This wasn't a popular campground with designated spots and fire pits. This was the kind of place only hunters and serious outdoorsmen came to. When we finally reached the site, the ground was damp, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. The river wasn't far. Maybe 50 yards through the trees, we could hear the water rushing over rocks. We set up camp, pitching our tents side by side near a small clearing. Mark built a fire, and we sat around it, eating canned food and watching the flames flicker against the trees. The night was quiet, too quiet. There was no distant hum of traffic, no animals scurrying in the underbrush, no birds calling from the treetops. Just the sound of the river and the occasional crackle of burning wood. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. I chalked it up to my own paranoia. Being this deep in the woods, away from civilization, made everything feel more intense. But at some point in the night, I heard something moving outside the tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not an animal. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled our tents, crunching over dead leaves, stopping just outside the thin fabric wall separating me from the darkness. I gripped the knife I kept in my sleeping bag, waiting. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. But after a long, tense moment, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. By morning, I convinced myself it had just been Mark, maybe checking on something outside. But when I stepped out of my tent, he was still zipped up in his, snoring. I told myself I imagined it. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and trying to enjoy the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods felt off. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a flicker of shadow, gone before I could focus on it. Then we found the deer. At first, I thought it was just a carcass left behind by a hunter, but the longer I looked, the worse it got. The thing wasn't just dead, it had been torn apart. Not eaten, not butchered, just destroyed. Its ribs were cracked open, its insides spilled out onto the forest floor, but nothing had been taken. Even Mark, who had spent his whole life hunting, looked unsettled. Bear, maybe, he muttered, but I didn't see any tracks. The rest of the day felt uneasy. Neither of us talked much. We stuck close to camp, keeping the fire going even though the sun was still up. I kept my knife on me at all times. That night, I barely slept. The footsteps came back, slow, careful, something circling the tents just like before. I held my breath, gripping my knife, listening. Then something touched my tent. Not a brush, not a scrape. Something pressed against it, just enough to make the fabric stretch inward. I wanted to call out to Mark, but my throat was dry. I stayed still, waiting, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the pressure lifted. The footsteps moved away. In the morning, I unzipped my tent the second there was light. Mark was already up, standing by the fire. His face was pale. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not paws, bare feet. We didn't talk about it. We just packed up and left. The hike back to the truck felt longer than before. The woods were dead silent. Not even the sound of birds. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear in and took off without a word. Neither of us ever mentioned it again. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I haven't gone camping since, and I never will. It was early October, and the forecast had warned of rain, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had planned this trip for weeks. I needed it. Life had been heavy lately, and getting away from everything, even for just a weekend, felt necessary. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual camping areas, where I wouldn't have to deal with other people. Just me, the forest, and some quiet. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected. The roads were slick from earlier rain, and the last few miles were rough, just gravel and mud. My truck struggled in some places, tires slipping a little, but it made it. I parked near a clearing, grabbed my pack, and started hiking. The sky was overcast, gray and thick, but it wasn't raining yet. The trail wasn't well maintained, which was part of the appeal. It was narrow, overgrown in some places and steep in others. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No road noise, no other hikers, just the occasional bird call and the wind shifting through the trees. I hiked for hours, crossing small streams, climbing over fallen logs, until I found the spot I had marked on my map. A small clearing near a lake, far from any roads or campsites. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground was damp, and I had to clear away wet leaves before pitching my tent. By the time I finished, the sky had darkened, and a light drizzle had started. I got a fire going, difficult but manageable, and made myself some food. The warmth of the fire felt good, but I could hear the wind picking up, rustling the trees, making them creak. By nightfall, the rain was steady. The fire struggled against the moisture in the air, and I decided to turn in early. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the rain patter against the tent. It was soothing at first, the kind of sound that makes you drift off easily. But at some point, I woke up. Something wasn't right. I lay still, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The rain was heavier now, a constant drumming on the tent. The wind had picked up too, pushing against the fabric. I thought maybe that was it, just the storm. But then I heard it, a sound outside. Not the wind, not the rain, something else. I held my breath, listening. It was faint, hard to hear over the storm, but it was there. Footsteps? No, more like movement, something shifting, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe or a raccoon, but it sounded too careful. I reached for my flashlight, turning it on, but I didn't unzip the tent yet. I needed to be sure before I stepped out into the cold rain. I waited, listening. The sound had stopped. Just the rain now. I stayed awake for a long time, but eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted back to sleep, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning, everything felt normal. The rain had stopped, though the sky was still heavy with clouds. My campsite looked untouched. No signs of anything unusual. I shook it off. Maybe it really had been just an animal, something passing through. I spent the day fishing by the lake, hiking a little further into the woods. By the time evening came, the rain had returned. That night, the feeling was back. I was in my tent, trying to sleep, but I couldn't shake the unease. The rain was heavier than before, and the wind had picked up even more, making the trees groan. And then I heard it again. Movement, closer this time. I sat up, heart pounding. My flashlight was in my hand before I even realized I had grabbed it. I listened, waiting. The sound was slow, deliberate, not the chaotic rustling of an animal scurrying through the underbrush. This was different. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The rain made it hard to see much, the beam of my flashlight catching only glistening tree trunks and dripping leaves. I scanned the area, breath held. Nothing. I almost convinced myself I was imagining things, that the storm was playing tricks on my ears. And then I saw it, a shape, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My heart slammed against my ribs. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a tree. It was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, in the rain, watching my tent. I didn't move either. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere in a storm like this? No campsites, no trails, just miles of deep forest. My flashlight wasn't strong enough to see details, but I knew they were looking at me. I had to do something. Slowly, I reached for the knife I always kept with me when camping. My fingers wrapped around the handle, grip tightening. But I didn't move yet. I just waited, hoping, praying that they would leave. But they didn't. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me sitting half out of my tent, them standing in the rain. But eventually, I blinked, and they were gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I packed up immediately. I wanted to tell myself it was just some lost hiker, but it didn't make sense. Why hadn't they called out? Why had they just stood there? Why did they disappear without a sound? The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. I kept looking over my shoulder, every noise making my nerves jump. The rain had stopped, but the forest felt heavier, like it was watching me leave. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, and I pulled away as fast as I could, tires spinning in the mud. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't camp alone anymore. I always liked camping alone. It gave me space to think, away from the noise of everything. I never saw it as risky. I was careful, packed well, and always let someone know where I was going. I wasn't the kind of guy to make stupid mistakes in the woods. I respected nature, and I was always prepared. It was the summer of 2018, and I had taken a week off work to go camping in the backcountry of Montana. I had found this area on a hiking forum, deep in the woods, far from any established campsites. No tourists, no loud groups, just miles of trees and silence. It was perfect. I parked my truck at the end of an old service road, shouldered my pack, and hiked about 6 miles into the woods. The area was beautiful, thick pines, scattered clearings, a quiet river running nearby. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no old campsites, no trash. I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good spot, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. I set up my tent, built a fire ring, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped low, I cooked some food over the fire and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person on earth. But something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush, just stillness. I shook it off, blaming my own paranoia. Maybe I had been in the city too long. That night, I slept lightly. Every little sound outside the tent had me waking up, listening. But there was nothing, just wind and the occasional creak of trees. The next morning, I packed up and decided to explore the area. I hiked a few miles deeper into the woods, following the creek. It led me to a larger clearing with an old fire pit in the middle. Someone had camped here before, but it had been a long time. The rocks were covered in moss, and the ashes had been washed away by rain. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. About 20 feet away, nailed to a tree, was an old wooden sign. It was weathered, cracked, barely hanging on. The words had faded, but I could still make them out. Stay out. That was it. No explanation, no details. Just those 2 words. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what it meant. Maybe it was from years ago, an old hunting area, private property, or some kind of warning about the terrain. But I hadn't seen any no trespassing signs when I entered the woods, and this felt different. I turned back and hiked toward my campsite, that uneasy feeling creeping back into my gut. That night, I built up my fire bigger than usual. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. Every time I looked into the trees, it felt like something had just moved out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died down to embers. The air was cold, and everything was silent. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. They were close, maybe 30 feet from my tent, just beyond the tree-line. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Nothing. Then a whisper. I didn't hear words, just the sound. Low, almost like someone was muttering under their breath. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag and stayed completely still. The whispering stopped. Then, the footsteps started again. Moving away this time. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. Everything looked normal. No tracks, no signs of anything. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up my gear and decided to leave. Something wasn't right out here. I wasn't the kind of person to get scared easily. But this didn't feel like normal camping weirdness. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. The feeling of being watched never left. About 2 miles from my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. A footprint, not mine, and not from a hiking boot. It was a barefoot, wide, heavy, deep in the dirt. Someone had been out here walking barefoot in the middle of the forest. I stared at it for a long time before I kept moving. My skin crawled the rest of the way back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors the second I got inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trailhead. Something moved, just for a second. A shadow between the trees. Too far to see clearly, but it was there, watching. I hit the gas and didn't look back. I never went back to that area. I never even tried to figure out what I had heard or seen. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some warnings are meant to be taken seriously. I don't camp alone anymore. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to sleep in a graveyard. It wasn't something I had planned, and it wasn't for the thrill of it either. It just happened. I was in my late 30s at the time, going through a rough patch in life. Work was draining, my personal life was nothing to talk about, and I was tired of everything. I wanted a break from the noise, from the stress, from people. So I packed up my gear, stuffed a tent into my old hiking bag, and decided to go somewhere quiet. I wasn't looking for adventure, just isolation. Somewhere away from the roads, away from the campsites where people would gather with their families, cooking meals over their campfires and laughing. I didn't want to hear laughter. I wanted silence. I found a spot on an old map, just a patch of green far from any town. It didn't have a name, just a few markings indicating some kind of historical site. I figured it would be an old abandoned ruin, maybe a forgotten farmstead, something with a bit of history but nothing too interesting. It was far enough from the main roads that I doubted anyone would be around, and that's exactly what I wanted. I parked my car a few miles away and hiked in, my pack feeling heavier with every step. The landscape was rugged, overgrown, untouched. No trails, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, probably just small animals. I liked it. It was peaceful. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was starting to set. The air was cooling, and the wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the trees. That's when I saw the headstones. At first, I thought they were just rocks, maybe old boundary markers. But as I got closer, I realized what they were. Weathered, leaning gravestones, some half sunk into the earth. The inscriptions were barely legible, worn away by time. There was no fence, no sign, nothing to indicate this was a graveyard. Just the stones, scattered haphazardly. Some so eroded they looked like jagged teeth poking out of the dirt. I stood there for a while, debating. I could turn back, find another spot. But I had already hiked miles, and the thought of retracing my steps in the dark didn't sit well with me. The place didn't feel eerie, just forgotten. It had been a long time since anyone cared about this patch of land. The dead didn't care where I slept, so I set up my tent right there, on the edge of the graves, making sure to avoid stepping on them as much as possible. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt like no one would mind. The ground was uneven, filled with roots and stones, but I managed to find a spot that was flat enough to be comfortable. By the time I had everything set up, night had fully settled in. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. The wind had picked up even more, carrying a chill that seeped into my clothes. I had planned to make a fire, but I decided against it. There was something about the silence of the place that made me want to leave it undisturbed. I sat there for a while, eating a cold meal from my pack, listening to the wind. The only other sound was the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling in the trees. It was peaceful in a way, but not comforting. There was no warmth to it, no sense of safety, just quiet. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay there, staring at the fabric above me. Sleep didn't come easily. The ground was hard, and the wind made the tent fabric ripple like something was moving outside. I kept telling myself it was just the weather, just the trees swaying. Somewhere in the night, I heard footsteps. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a fox, but these weren't the light, skittering steps of a small creature. They were deliberate, heavy, slow, like someone walking barefoot on the uneven ground. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, closer. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight, waiting. But then the footsteps stopped completely. The wind kept blowing, the trees kept rustling, but nothing else. No crunch of leaves, no snap of twigs, just stillness. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity before exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke up, it was still dark. The air inside the tent was cold, and the fabric was damp with condensation. I checked my watch, it was just after 3 in the morning. My body was stiff from the hard ground, but something else had woken me. There was no wind anymore, no rustling, no movement, just dead silence. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer this time, right outside the tent. Slow, steady. A few steps, then a pause. Then another. I gripped my flashlight again, my heart pounding. I wanted to call out, to say something, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. The footsteps circled the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt, the shifting of grass. They stopped just behind my tent, where I couldn't see. I barely breathed, my hands sweating around the flashlight. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything. Breathing, movement, anything. But there was nothing, just silence. Then something pressed against the fabric of my tent. Not hard, just enough to make an imprint. Like a hand, fingers splayed out. I snapped on the flashlight, aiming it at the spot. But by the time the beam hit, the pressure was gone. The fabric was smooth again, undisturbed. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, flashlight in hand, waiting for dawn. When the first hints of light crept through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The ground was damp with morning dew, and everything looked normal. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't bother eating, didn't take my time. I just wanted to get away from that place. As I turned to leave, I noticed something. One of the gravestones, the one closest to my tent, had been cleaned. The dirt that had once covered the inscription was gone. The letters clear. It was a name I didn't recognize, but the date stood out. The death date was exactly 100 years ago to the day. I didn't stay to think about it. I hiked back to my car without stopping, without looking back. I don't camp alone anymore. It was late autumn when I decided to go camping alone in the woods outside a small town in Montana. The trees were half bare, their skeletal branches reaching up into a sky that had been gray all day. The air was cold but not freezing, just enough to make my breath visible in the fading light. The forecast had said there might be rain, but I had packed accordingly. I didn't mind roughing it. I had been on solo trips before. Something about the quiet of nature pulled me back every time, no matter how much the world changed. The area I had chosen was remote, about a 3-hour drive from my house. I had been here before years ago, but it had been summer then. Now, with the season shifting into winter, the place felt different. The trails were empty, and I had seen only 2 other cars parked near the entrance to the forest. I assumed hunters or hikers. I had driven another 20 minutes down a narrow dirt road before pulling off into a clearing. There were no signs of anyone else camping nearby, just trees, the smell of damp earth, and the occasional rustling of dry leaves carried by the wind. I set up my tent near a fallen tree, positioned so I could use it as a windbreak. After gathering some wood for a fire, I got it going and settled in for the night. I had brought some food, nothing fancy, just the usual campfire meal. As I sat there eating, watching the flames flicker, I felt at ease. It had been a long week at work, and I needed this escape. By the time the sun fully disappeared, the woods around me became pitch dark. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. Probably deer, maybe a fox. I wasn't worried. Out here, the biggest threat was usually the weather or a poorly planned route. I had just started to douse the fire when I saw something. A figure in the distance, barely visible between the trees. It was hard to tell at first, but as I focused, I could make out the silhouette of a man. He was standing just far enough away that I couldn't see any details, only that he was watching. At first, I assumed it was another camper or a hunter, maybe someone who had spotted my fire and was curious. But he didn't move. He didn't call out or make his presence known. He just stood there, still, as if he was waiting for something. I felt uneasy but tried to brush it off. I wasn't trespassing, and I had every right to be here. Still, something about the way he stood there made my skin crawl. I turned back toward my tent, pretending not to care, and continued putting out the fire. When I glanced back again, he was gone. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me twitch. I kept my knife close, even knowing it was probably nothing. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, never left me. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to stay another night. I had planned for a 2-day trip, and I wasn't going to let one strange encounter ruin it. I spent most of the day hiking, exploring areas I hadn't seen in years. The landscape was beautiful, even in the cold. At times, I almost forgot about the man in the woods. Almost. It was when I returned to camp that I noticed something was wrong. My tent had been moved. Not much, just a few inches, but enough for me to know it wasn't the wind. My gear had been shuffled around. My bag was open, though nothing seemed to be missing. The firewood I had left stacked was knocked over. Someone had been here. My gut told me it was the man from last night. Maybe he had come closer while I was gone. Checked my camp, looking for something. But why? He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't left any clear signs of aggression. Just an intrusion, a quiet violation of my space. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to be chased out. I had a rifle in my truck and my knife with me. If someone was messing with me, I could handle it. That night, I built my fire higher. I wanted to make sure I could see in all directions. If he came back, I wanted to know. The forest around me was silent, unnervingly so. Even the usual rustling of animals seemed distant. I sat there for hours, staring into the trees, waiting. Then I saw him again, closer this time. He stepped out of the trees slowly, like he wanted me to see him. The firelight flickered against his face, revealing details I hadn't noticed before. His clothes were dark, simple. His face was lean, almost gaunt. But his eyes were what unsettled me the most. There was something calculated about them. He was watching me, but not in a way that felt random. Not like a lost hiker or someone just curious. It was intentional. I didn't move. I wanted to see what he would do. For a long time, he just stood there. Then, without a sound, he took a step back and disappeared into the darkness. I stayed awake the entire night, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, light footsteps, a branch moving, but I couldn't be sure. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. My body was tense, waiting for him to show up again. But he didn't. Not while I packed. Not while I loaded my truck. It wasn't until I started driving that I saw him again. He was standing just off the road, watching me go. This time, though, he wasn't alone. There were two of them. The second man was older, with a rigid posture. Even from a distance, something about him seemed military. The way he stood, the way he scanned the area. He wasn't just some random person. And then I understood. The man who had been watching me, he wasn't just anyone. He was a soldier who had been out here for a reason. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove straight out of that forest and didn't look back. Later, when I checked the local news, I found a story. A body had been discovered in the woods not far from where I had camped. The victim was an off-duty soldier, missing for days. The details were sparse, but one thing was clear. He had been murdered. And the man I had seen, he wasn't just some drifter. He was the killer, and I had almost been next. I've always liked camping. It gives me a break from the noise of everyday life. No emails, no calls, no stress. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire. But ever since my last trip, I haven't gone back. I don't think I ever will. It was late September, just cool enough that the air felt crisp but not so cold that I'd be uncomfortable at night. I chose a quiet spot in a forest up north, a few hours' drive from home. I'd been there before, deep enough that I wouldn't see other campers, but not too far that I couldn't hike back to my truck if needed. I arrived in the afternoon and set up my tent on a small clearing near a stream. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The place was quiet except for the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, probably squirrels or birds. I spent the evening collecting wood, setting up my fire, and cooking a simple meal over the flames. Everything was peaceful. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest turned dark, I noticed something odd. There was a smell in the air, faint but noticeable. It was a damp, rotten smell, like old wood left to decay in the rain. I figured it was from the nearby stream, maybe some dead fish or rotting vegetation. It didn't bother me much at first, but it lingered longer than it should have. I stayed by the fire for a while, enjoying the warmth. When it got late, I decided to turn in. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the occasional crack of the fire outside. The forest was still and quiet, except for the distant call of an owl. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had snapped a branch outside. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was heavier, like a footstep. I held my breath, listening. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. Then another crack, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, trying to keep my breathing steady. I listened hard, but the noise had stopped. Maybe it was just a deer. I'd seen plenty of them on past trips. Still, something felt off. I sat up, unzipped the tent just a little, and shined my flashlight outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The trees beyond the clearing stood tall and dark, barely moving in the still air. And then I saw her. A woman stood just beyond the reach of my flashlight, partially hidden by the trees. Her clothes were dark and loose, hanging off her thin frame. Her face was pale, but I couldn't make out her features clearly. She wasn't moving, just standing there watching. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out to ask if she needed help, but something in the way she stood, still and silent, made my throat tighten. Then, slowly, she took a step back, disappearing into the darkness. I waited, straining to hear any sound of her leaving, but there was nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, barely moving, listening to the forest. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I wasn't about to start hiking in the dark. So I waited. By morning, I convinced myself that maybe she was just some lost hiker. A strange one, sure, but harmless. Maybe she hadn't even seen me. Maybe she'd just been passing through. Still, I decided I'd had enough of camping for one trip. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack. As I took down my tent, I noticed something on the ground near my campsite. Bare footprints. They led from the tree line to where she had stood. But what disturbed me the most was that there were no footprints leading away. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my pack, stomped out my fire, and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I haven't been camping since. I never thought much about camping alone. I had done it before. Set up my tent, started a fire, cooked my own food, and spent the night listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful in a way that few things in life were. But peace can turn into something else in the blink of an eye. This happened in 2019. I was 32 at the time, and I had a habit of heading out into the wilderness whenever life started to feel too crowded. That summer had been especially draining. So I packed up my truck and drove a few hours north of the city to a place I had been once before, deep in a national forest. The spot I picked was remote, far from any major trails or campgrounds. The closest town was at least an hour's drive away, and I doubted many people came through there. That was the appeal. I wanted silence, space, and the kind of night where the only light came from the stars and my fire. I arrived in the early evening, later than I had planned. The drive had taken longer because some of the dirt roads were washed out from recent rain, and I had to be careful not to get my truck stuck in deep mud. By the time I found a good clearing and parked, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees. I set up quickly. My tent was a simple one, a one-person setup that didn't take long to pitch. I got a fire going and cooked some food, enjoying the quiet as the forest darkened around me. It was the kind of darkness you only get when you're far from cities, thick, absolute, with shadows that seem deeper than they should be. The first few hours were exactly what I had hoped for. The fire crackled, the night air was cool but not too cold, and the sky was full of stars. I sat back in my camping chair, stretched out my legs, and let myself relax. That changed when I heard the first noise. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I glanced up from the fire, listening. The forest had its own sounds at night, and I had spent enough time outdoors to know what was normal. This didn't feel normal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Something moving through the underbrush. I went back to my fire, but my body had already shifted into alertness. The next sound was closer. Another snap, followed by a rustling. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only reached so far before getting swallowed by darkness. I didn't see anything. I told myself again that it was just an animal. Maybe a large one, maybe not. Either way, I wasn't going to let it ruin my night. I tried to shake it off. The next hour was quiet. Too quiet. No insects buzzing, no owls hooting. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't realize how tense I was until I stood up to stretch and felt how stiff my back had become. I shook it off and threw another log onto the fire, hoping the extra light would make me feel better. That's when I saw the footprint. It was just past the fire's glow, pressed into the soft dirt near the trees. It was a boot print, too large to be mine. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I left that there earlier without realizing it? Had someone been out here before me? I stood there for a long time, staring at that print, waiting for some logical explanation to come to me. But there wasn't one. The night was still. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness, feeling more exposed than I ever had before. Then I heard breathing, not my own. Low, steady, coming from the trees. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't see anything, but I knew. Asterisk, asterisk, someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Asterisk, asterisk. I took a step back toward my tent, my mind racing. I had my truck. I could leave. But if someone was out there, had they tampered with it? Had they flattened a tire? Blocked the path? I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, my hand shaking. Nothing. The sound had stopped, but I knew what I had heard. I turned, walked quickly to my truck, and checked the tires. They were fine, but I still didn't feel right. I made a decision then. I wasn't going to spend the night. I packed up as quickly as I could, shoving everything into the truck bed without bothering to do it neatly. Every few seconds, I stopped to listen. I didn't hear anything, but I felt something. Presence. A weight in the air. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound shattered the silence, and for a second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. I didn't stay to find out. I threw it into reverse, turned around, and took off down the dirt road. My headlights carved a path through the darkness, and I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was well past the forest's edge, until I saw the first hints of civilization again. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I never went back to that spot. I still love camping. I still go out into the wilderness, but I don't go alone anymore, and I never ignore the feeling that I'm being watched. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Appalachian woods. I had done solo trips before, but always in places where trails were well marked and campsites were at least somewhat within reach of other people. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to push myself, go somewhere remote, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. I planned for everything. My pack was loaded with enough food and water for 4 days, a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, and enough supplies to keep me safe. I carried a knife, a hatchet, and a .357 revolver. I wasn't worried about people. I was worried about bears, coyotes, or anything else that might see me as food. The hike in was long and rough. I had studied maps and used my GPS to chart a route, but these trails weren't well maintained. Some parts were overgrown, and I had to push through thick brush. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I don't mean peaceful quiet. I mean the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. By the time I found a good clearing to set up camp, the sun was hanging low. The trees were tall and dense, their branches weaving together to block out the last bits of light. I cleared a patch of ground, set up my tent, and started a small fire. My body ached from the long hike, but I felt good. I was miles from civilization, alone in the wild, just how I wanted. But something felt off. As night fell, I sat by the fire eating a protein bar. The silence around me was unnatural. Usually you hear insects buzzing, owls hooting, or maybe a distant coyote howl. But there was nothing, just the crackling of my fire. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the thickness of the forest blocking sound. Maybe I was overthinking it, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was close, branches snapping, the rustling of leaves. Something was moving in the dark, just outside the reach of my fire's glow. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. My hand rested on the grip of my revolver, heart pounding. Could be a deer, could be a bear, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right with me. It stopped. I stared into the dark, waiting for whatever it was to make another move. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. My breath felt too loud in my own ears. Nothing. I forced myself to relax, but I kept my gun close. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal passing through. Either way, I wasn't going to let it ruin my trip. I banked the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it shut. Sleep didn't come easy. Every tiny noise outside made my body tense up. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, the trees, the normal sounds of the forest. Then, sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. Footsteps, not an animal, not a four-legged shuffle. These were slow, deliberate steps, human. I held my breath, gripping my revolver tight. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The steps were close, just outside my tent. Then, the worst sound yet. A deep inhale. Someone was standing right outside my tent, breathing in through their nose, slow and heavy, like they were smelling the air. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump out, gun raised, and scare them off. But I didn't move. I just laid there, heart hammering, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then the steps moved away. Slow, steady, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I laid there, gripping my gun, waiting for the sound to come back. But it never did. As soon as the first light of morning broke through the trees, I was up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the area. Nothing.
No footprints.
No signs of anyone being there. Just the untouched forest around me. I packed up fast. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to stick around to find out more. The hike back felt longer. My nerves were shot. Every little sound made me jump. I kept my gun in my hand the entire way. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack inside, got in, and locked the doors. Only when I was back on the main road did I start to breathe easy. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't ever want to find out. It was early October, and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: a solo weekend away in the Yorkshire moors, where I could clear my head and escape from the constant noise of my life back in Manchester. The moors were vast, rugged, and quiet, the kind of place where you could walk for miles and not see another soul. I had done solo camping before, but never here. My usual spots were in the Lake District or the Peak District, where the paths were well marked, and you were never too far from some sign of civilization. But the moors were different. There were no towering mountains, just rolling, endless hills covered in thick grass and heather, stretching out in every direction. I had seen photos of the place online. Endless skies, mist rolling over the hills at dawn. It looked perfect. I packed my gear on a Friday afternoon. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a small stove, some dehydrated meals, and enough water to last me 2 days. My phone was fully charged, though I knew I wouldn't have much signal. I also brought a physical map and a compass just in case. I drove out of the city, the roads turning from motorways to smaller country lanes, until finally, I arrived at a parking area near the edge of the moors. There was no visitor center, no proper campsite, just a small gravel pull-off where a couple of other cars were parked. I assumed they belonged to hikers. I locked my car, hoisted my backpack over my shoulders, and set off. The first few hours were everything I had hoped for. The air was crisp but not too cold. The sky a dull gray that made the golden brown hills seem even more dramatic. The land stretched on forever, with hardly any trees, just open space. The path I followed was narrow and muddy in places, but easy enough to walk on. By late afternoon, I had reached a spot that seemed ideal. A flat stretch of land near a small stream, surrounded by gentle hills. There were no signs that anyone had camped there recently. No fire pits, no trash, nothing. I set up my tent quickly, rolling out my sleeping bag and checking my supplies. I had plenty of food and water, and though the wind had picked up, my tent was sturdy enough to handle it. After a quick meal, I sat outside for a while, listening to the sound of the wind rushing through the grass. The quiet was incredible. No cars, no voices, just nature. As the sun dipped below the hills, the temperature dropped. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and turned off my torch. I woke up sometime in the night, feeling uneasy. At first, I wasn't sure why. The wind had died down, and the moors were completely silent. No owls, no rustling grass, just silence. Then I heard it, a single footstep somewhere outside my tent. I held my breath. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, a slow, careful step on the damp earth. I stayed completely still, listening. Another step, then another. Someone was out there. I reached for my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. I glanced at my watch, just past 2 a.m. My first thought was that maybe it was another hiker, lost and looking for help. But why would they be walking so slowly, so carefully? I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. The footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like forever, my ears straining. My tent was a lightweight one, made of thin material. If someone really wanted to get in, they could do it in seconds. I considered calling out, but something told me not to. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. The sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There were no footprints. The ground was damp and soft. There should have been some sign, but there was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had shifted something outside, and my half-asleep brain had turned it into footsteps. I made breakfast, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I considered packing up and heading back to my car, but I had planned for 2 nights. If I left now, it would feel like I was running away from nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination and decided to stay. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The day passed without incident. I hiked further into the moors, making sure to mark my path so I wouldn't get lost. The landscape was stunning. Huge open skies, rolling hills stretching forever. But despite the beauty, I felt uneasy. I returned to my campsite before dark, not wanting to be caught out too late. As the last light faded, I crawled into my tent, forcing myself to relax. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing, just outside my tent. It was slow and deep. Someone, or something, was standing just outside the thin layer of fabric, breathing. I lay frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The breathing stopped. Then, a single finger ran along the side of my tent. Slowly, from top to bottom, I stopped breathing. The silence stretched on. Then, just like the night before, the presence moved away. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting back to my car. I walked fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The moors felt different now, less open, more suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the gravel pull-off. My car was there, untouched. I threw my pack in the boot, got in, and locked the doors. As I turned the key, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. At the edge of the moor, just before the hills swallowed the land, stood a figure. Too far to see details, but close enough that I knew it was watching me. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I told myself I wouldn't think about it, that I would forget it. But weeks later, I found myself looking up stories about the moors. Missing hikers, strange sightings, people disappearing without a trace. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I had been training with Adam for almost 2 years. We met at the gym, bonded over deadlifts and protein shakes, and somehow became close friends despite barely knowing much about each other outside of training. He was the kind of guy who never skipped leg day, always pushed himself harder than necessary, and had a quiet, disciplined nature. We didn't talk much outside of workouts, but when we did, it was mostly about training, diet, or general fitness. One day, he brought up camping. Said he needed a break from the gym, from the city. He mentioned a spot a few hours out, somewhere in the mountains, deep into the forest. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps, a little off the beaten path. He told me it was remote, quiet, the perfect place to clear the mind. I wasn't big on camping, but I liked the idea of a challenge. No distractions, no comfort, just surviving for a few days. Sounded like a good way to test myself outside of the gym. So I agreed. We packed light tents, sleeping bags, some food, and gear. No fancy equipment, no luxuries, just enough to keep us going. The drive out was long, the roads winding, the last stretch nothing but dirt and gravel. No phone signal, no signs of people. The last place we saw before turning off into the woods was an old, run-down gas station. The kind where the windows were covered in grime, the sign was half broken, and there was only one pump that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The guy behind the counter barely looked up when we grabbed a couple of bottles of water and an extra can of fuel. We drove for another hour after that, deeper into the trees until the road itself was gone, replaced by a rough, overgrown path. Adam had been here before, knew where to go, so I trusted him to lead the way. When we finally stopped, the forest was thick, the trees tall and packed close together. The air smelled damp, earthy. No sounds except the wind through the branches and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. We set up camp near a small clearing, right by a river. It was a good spot. Fresh water nearby, flat ground for the tents, and plenty of space to move around. We built a fire, cooked some food, and settled in for the night. That first night was uneventful. Cold, quiet, almost too still. I barely slept. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because something about the place felt off. Like the silence was too deep, the kind that didn't feel natural. The next morning, we went for a run, keeping up our training even out here. It was tough, the uneven ground and thick brush making every step harder. But it felt good. Afterward, we decided to hike up the ridge to get a better view of the area. That's when we noticed something strange. There were tracks. Not animal tracks, not human either. Something in between. They were deep, wide, like something heavy had passed through. The stride was long, longer than any normal step. Adam stared at them for a while, his expression unreadable. We followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the thicker part of the forest, where the trees were too close together to see much. I shrugged it off, assumed it was nothing, maybe just an animal with an odd gait. The rest of the day was normal. We trained a bit, cooked more food, talked about fitness goals. Nothing weird, but that night things changed. I woke up to a sound. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving around the tents. I didn't move at first, just listened. The fire had burned down to embers, barely any light. I could hear Adam's breathing in the other tent. Slow, steady, asleep. Then something brushed against my tent. I froze. Whatever it was close. Too close. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled the tent again, then stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I lay there, heart pounding, barely breathing. Eventually, sleep took over. The next morning, Adam was already up, staring at the ground near the fire pit. The same tracks we'd seen on the ridge were there, but this time they were around our camp. Close, too close. We didn't talk about it, just packed up our gear, ate quickly, and decided to move deeper into the woods, away from whatever had been out there. Maybe it was a bad idea, but staying put didn't feel any better. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the air heavier. And then we found something. A cabin. Old, abandoned, the wood dark with age. No windows, just empty holes where glass used to be. The door was slightly open. Adam walked up first, peering inside. I followed, hesitant. The inside was empty, just a single chair in the middle of the room. Dust-covered, untouched for years. But the floor had marks. Dragged marks. Something had been pulled across the floor, deep scratches in the wood. I looked at Adam. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We left. That night, we barely slept. We didn't make a fire, just sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the tents. Something pressed against the fabric, hard enough to push it inward. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Then it was gone, just like that. The next morning, we packed up. No words, no discussion. We just knew. The hike back was tense. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching. By the time we reached the truck, the relief was overwhelming. We threw our gear in the back, got in, and drove without looking back. The gas station was still there when we passed it, the same guy behind the counter. He glanced at us as we filled up, then at the truck. "Back from the woods?" he said, his voice flat. We nodded. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath before turning away. We didn't ask what he said. Didn't want to know. We never talked about that trip after that. Never went camping again. Some things are better left alone.